go. For many years, the supercars of Sergio Rossi had gone almost completely unnoticed by Gio. Occasionally, he would hear the ear-shattering roar of a distant engine heralding its arrival with its cacophonous steel trumpets. Across the mountain, the workers would stop for a moment and shake their heads at the mechanical monstrosity that had awoken to destroy the tranquility of the day. The cicadas, chirping away in the savage oven-like heat, would suddenly go silent as the noise boomed and echoed around the hillside. Dogs would bark, goats would try to break loose of their ties, and then eventually, when silence returned, everybody, goats and cicadas alike, would continue doing whatever it was they had been doing. It was usually a short-lived interruption, and Gio and the rest of the people of Castello di Vergine Maria and the nearby sanitarium eventually became oblivious to the diabolical noises of Sergio Rossi's automobiles. At this time in Gio's life, automobiles, trucks, and motorcycles were of no interest whatsoever. His only love was swimming. He lived to dive into the crystal blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea, to fight his way to the bottom of the rock pools to chase and catch fish with his bare hands. All of which, unbeknown to Gio, was often watched in admiration by Sergio Rossi from the large checkerboard marble terrazza of the estate house high on the mountainside. The balustrades of the terrazza were built to within a knife's edge of the rocks directly above the vast drop to the cemetery. Sergio had spotted Gio playing like this a few years ago, and one day found himself holding his breath when Gio disappeared under the sea. He was both impressed and aggravated that he had gasped for air long before Gio had emerged from his underwater activity. Sergio had unwittingly gone into competition with Gio and was troubled by his inability to beat this young boy in the private game of breath-holding. In his youth, there was nobody who could stay underwater longer than Sergio could. As a man, Sergio was used to getting his own way and believed unwaveringly in his own convictions. Troubled by his self-inflicted defeat in the breathing game, he had decided that it was time for Gio to put aside such childish pursuits. It would form the basis of a private project he had been musing over for some time now, and one which would change the life of everyone at the Castello irrevocably. It was no good, he told himself, for a boy like that to waste his life. I shall have to give this some thought. Eventually, he came upon the solution, and perhaps a way he could win and regain victory in a competition only he knew was in play. Sergio was sat having breakfast upon the terrazza with his wife Silvia Rossi. Silvia was a classically beautiful Mediterranean brunette with dark curly hair, a fine aquiline nose, soft brown almond-shaped eyes, and the right kind of curves in the places a man like Sergio Rossi expected them to be. I have decided that the swimming boy, Gio, I believe he is called, is lacking purposeful direction in his life, he declared. Who, dear? She asked, having only tuned into the conversation halfway, though. Ernesto's boy? But he is just a child, and besides, what business is he of yours? Never mind that. I am his father's employer, and as such, his family is also my responsibility. If I am to make of him a perfect racing driver, then I need to imprint upon him now while he is still a boy. I need to teach him the essence of driving technique. Sergio looked to his wife for the necessary approval, but she continued reading the morning paper. Taking her lack of response as agreement, he continued. Driving at speed needs to be learnt like anything a child learns. I remember how easy it was for me as a boy to learn to speak Russian or classical Greek. I didn't waste my days swimming in the sea. That, my darling, is the only way a man can truly master the automobile. Imprint as a boy. Sergio Rossi had it fixed in his mind that Gio would be that boy. Silvia put down the paper and looked at Sergio with a long, deep frown. She was furious. It is the worst idea imaginable. You are yet again playing with fire and the life of another man's child, she barked savagely. Sergio's head jolted backwards, startled by her instant and aggressive response. She was as demonstrable in her fury as only an Italian wife can be. Sergio took a peaceful retreat and said nothing further about it at breakfast that morning. A few days later, Sergio considered time enough had passed since Silvia's disapproval, and he had requested Ernesto to come up and see him at the house. Ernesto disliked being called to see the boss. It usually meant more work, less pay, or a mix of both. Above the terrazza, through a window of half-closed shutters, Silvia Rossi opened a suitcase on the bed, From fine mahogany drawers, she began to remove a variety of silk blouses, designer skirts, elegant slacks, and delicate lingerie, and placed them carefully into the suitcase. She opened an ornate jade jewelry box on the top of a chest, removed a string of pearls, and slung them casually on top of the lingerie. She briefly checked her ears with a touch of her fingers for the matching pair of pearl earrings. Next to the box sat a black-and-white photo of Sergio Rossi passing the finishing line in an old open-wheel race car. He wore a leather cap and brass-rimmed glass goggles. His smoke-covered cheeks, white teeth, and mustache were all that could be seen of his face. She recounted the argument from breakfast that day. "He could be a great driver," Sergio yelled. "He is just a boy," she replied. "He has suffered enough already." "Nonsense. His mother died a long time ago. I expect he can hardly remember it. He is 15 now, soon to be 16. More than ready." "I won't stay here and watch you destroy his life," she had shouted back with finality. Sylvia laid the photo face down on the chest, closed the suitcase, and snapped the latches shut. She picked the suitcase up, left the bedroom, and began to walk along the large gallery landing towards the fine curved staircase. She heard the bell ring downstairs and stopped. The maid went to the door and opened it. Ernesto stood, cap in hand, and was ushered into the cool, dark entrance hall. The maid pointed to a pair of glass-paneled doors which opened out onto the terrazza. Ernesto looked at the maid and shrugged. She shook her head in sympathetic acknowledgement and disappeared through a side door. Ernesto walked towards the glass doors that opened out onto the huge, checkerboard, marbled antique floor of the terrazza. He looked upwards to see Silvia Rossi stood, suitcase in hand, motionlessly watching him. "Signora," he said, nodding his head. "Good morning, Ernesto," she replied warmly. Sergio was wearing dark blue chinos, a crisp white shirt finished with circular gold cufflinks and a gold cravat. He was sat at an equally well-dressed table of white linen covered with an assortment of silverware and gold-rimmed white porcelain. He was reading the newspaper and had not noticed Ernesto arrive. Ernesto gave a brief cough. Sergio looked up and motioned Ernesto with a wave of his hand to the chair in front of him whilst gracefully folding his newspaper up and laying it down beside the silver coffee pot. "Come, sit down," said Sergio. Ernesto slapped his cap against his leg as a jockey might to budge a stubborn horse. He moved slowly towards the chair facing Sergio. He sat down and waited silently. "That's a fine boy you have, Ernesto," remarked Sergio. "How old is he now? 15? 16? "He turned 15 last week, signore," replied Ernesto. "Yes, 15, but 16 comes soon enough, and then girls, yes?" said Sergio emphatically, pointing a finger at Ernesto. "Yes, I suppose," said Ernesto with a shrug, conceding to his employer rather than pointing out Gio's apparent lack of interest in girls. Sergio acknowledged the response with a look of suspicion, picked up a white linen serviette, and brushed the tails of his mustache clean. Sergio had the natural ambivalent air of aristocracy. He looked at Ernesto carefully, broadening his eyes the way a cat might before launching and sinking its teeth into a helpless bird. He looked directly at Ernesto with this deep, dark scowl for a few moments, gathering his thoughts, considering his attack proposition, before relaxing his expression and releasing a huge, warm smile. Sergio believed it to be a form of hypnotism, a trick he'd learnt during the war when bartering with the Germans. It was absolutely worthless, of course, but Sergio believed it rendered his victim defenseless, weak and helpless against his more powerful will. That was essential if they were to fully submit to his requirements. "If you don't mind my saying so, I have been thinking upon your problem," said Sergio. Ernesto, genuinely captivated, was stumped and began to wonder what his problem could be. "I think it is the correct time for Gio to become a little more, shall we say, a little more of a man and a little less of a boy, yes? He swims all day like a fish. Did you know that?" probed Sergio. Ernesto nodded in agreement. "Did you know that I used to catch fish as a boy in that very same place?" Ernesto again nodded his head in agreement. "And I can tell you," he continued, "that it is very difficult. It takes tremendous tenacity, strength, and agility. But above all, it takes a keen desire to win if you are to ever catch one of those little bastard fish. It is a rare thing, a talent like that. Don't you agree?" Ernesto nodded, even though he thought it unremarkable and typical of many Palermo boys who would otherwise not eat if they didn't learn how to catch fish. Sergio smiled, and with Ernesto's agreement, he felt certain that victory would be his. Good. So now that we are in agreement, Sergio continued, I don't need to tell you that a fisherman has no future in Sicily. As the principal employer in this area, I should know. Tuna fishing? It's a dirty old job, and no life for a boy to pursue in this modern world. Sergio examined every detail of Ernesto's reaction as he spoke. I expect he was just hungry, replied Ernesto. Sergio laughed and nodded, though he noted the subtlety of the rebuttal. What? But he does that every day. No, I won't hear of it. I pay enough to feed you and your boy, Ernesto. He is without direction, and I mean to give it to him if you won't, replied Sergio, who pushed the point. Oh, no, I didn't mean that. What kind of direction? Said Ernesto. He twisted his cap into a tight knot beneath the table. Ernesto looked visibly sorry and rebuked himself for disrespecting his boss so openly. Sergio recognized that kind of look and waved him to stop fussing. He cared little for this man's feelings. He had his own plans for Gio and was determined that his father's peasant ways would not interfere with them. Well, I believe such a talent should not go to waste, and he is approaching the age when boys in Sicily can become, shall we say, easily distracted by the wrong sort of life. Ernesto nodded. He knew what that meant. Far too many boys grew up without a job, without the conviction to succeed, and invariably became petty criminals without any kind of prospects in life. I personally know many unscrupulous men who would enlist a boy like yours into their criminal activities, immune from the law, and by the time they understand what life is about, they can understand nothing else, pressed Sergio. No, your boy is going to have a better chance than that, and I am going to give it to him. So, starting from tomorrow, I want you to instruct him to clean my cars. Ernesto looked up startled, surprised, and relieved. Is that all? He thought to himself. But what about Bernardo? Does he not clean them already? Asked Ernesto. The last thing he wanted was to unleash the wrath of the housekeeping staff by putting Bernardo out of a desperately needed job. Bernardo is my driver, of course, but he is getting old, and it has become too much for him to drive and clean the cars, said Sergio with finality. Do you agree, Ernesto? Well, yes, signore, it would be a fine job. Thank you, conceded Ernesto. Good, then it is settled. I will pay him 500 lira into his hand, and 500 lira a day into a named bank account for him, to be handed over to him when he is 16. And because I know a working boy eats like a horse, and not having a wife, I don't suppose you know how to cook. I think you both shall eat with the staff during the day. Agreed? Yes, signore. Thank you very much, said Ernesto, who overlooked the insult in astonishment of what was an unusually good wage for a boy of Gio's age. That's all right, Ernesto. Just you make sure he works every day except Sunday until he returns to school. Now, back to your work. My prize-winning lemons need watering. I predict it is going to be a very hot summer, and I don't want a withered crop because you're sat here talking to me, finished Sergio with a smile. Ernesto stood up, nodded, and walked towards the balcony doors, wondering with the deep feeling of unease that all fathers have when an unexpected and unannounced external event suddenly takes a controlling hand over the future of their children.